Midnight in Beauchamp by Anna Catherine Green. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julia Albert. Midnight in Beauchamp by Anna Catherine Green. It was the last house in Beauchamp, and it stood several rods away from its nearest neighbor. It was a pretty house in the daytime, but owing to its steep, sloping roof and small bediamonded windows, it had a lonesome nook at night, notwithstanding the crimson hall light which shone through the leaves of its vine-covered doorway. Ned Chivers lived in it with his 6 months married bride, and as he was both a busy fellow and a gay one, there were many evenings when pretty Lady Shiver sat alone until near midnight. She was of an uncomplaining spirit, however, and said little, though there were times when both the day and evening seemed very long and married life not altogether the paradise she had expected. On this evening, a memorable evening for her, the 24th of December 1894, she had expected her husband to remain with her, for it was not only Christmas Eve, but the night when, as manager of a large manufacturing concern, he brought up from New York the money with which to pay off the men on the next working day, and he never left her when there was any unusual amount of money in the house. But from the first glimpse she had of him coming up the road, she knew she was to be disappointed in this hope, and, indignant, alarmed almost, at the prospect of a lonesome evening under these circumstances, she ran hastily down to the gate to meet him, crying, "Oh, Ned, you look so troubled! I know you have only come home for a hurried supper. But you cannot leave me tonight. Tenny, their only maid, has gone for a holiday, and I never can stay in this house alone with all that." She pointed to the small bag he carried, which, as she knew, was filled to bursting with banknotes. He certainly looked troubled. It is hard to resist the entreaty in a young bride's uplifted face. But this time he could not help himself, and he said, "I'm dreadful sorry, but I must ride over to Fairbanks tonight. Mr. Pearson has given me an imperative order to conclude a matter of business there, and it is very important that it should be done. I should lose my position if I neglect this matter, and no one but housebrook and Suffren knows that we keep the money in the house. I have always given out that I entrust it to Hale's safe overnight." "But I cannot stand it," she persisted. "You have never left me on these nights. That is why I let Tenny go. I will spend the evening at the Larches, or, better still, call in Mr. and Mrs. Talcott to keep me company." But her husband did not approve of her going out or of her having company. The Larches was too far away, and as for Mr. and Mrs. Talcott, they were meddlesome people whom he had never liked. Besides, Mrs. Talcott was delicate, and the night threatened storm. It seemed hard to subject her to this ordeal, and he showed that he thought so by his manner, but, as circumstances were, she would have to stay alone, and he only hoped she would be brave and go to bed like a good girl, and think nothing about the money, which she would take care to put away in a very safe place. "Or," said he, kissing her downcast face, "perhaps you would rather hide it yourself. Women always have curious ideas about such things." "Yes, let me hide it," she murmured. "The money, I mean, not the bag. Everyone knows the bag. I should never dare to leave it in that." And begging him to unlock it, she began to empty it with a feverish haste that rather alarmed him, for he surveyed her anxiously and shook his head as if he dreaded the effects of this excitement upon her. But as he saw no way of averting it, he confined himself to using such soothing words as were at his command, and then, Humoring her weakness, helped her to arrange the bills in the place she had chosen, and restuffing the bag with old receipts till it acquired its former dimensions, he put a few bills on top to make the whole look natural, and, laughing at her white face, relocked the bag and put the key back in his pocket. "There, dear, a notable scheme, and one that should relieve your mind entirely," he cried. "If anyone should attempt burglary in my absence, and should succeed in getting into a house as safely locked as this will be when I leave it, then trust to their being satisfied when they see this booty, which I shall hide where I always hide it, in the cupboard above my desk." "And when will you be back?" she murmured, trembling in spite of herself at these preparations. "By 1 o'clock, if possible." "Certainly by 2." "And our neighbours go to bed at 10," she murmured. But the words were low, and she was glad he did not hear them, for if it was his duty to obey the orders he had received, then it was her duty to meet the position in which it left her as bravely as she could. At supper she was so natural that his face rapidly brightened, and it was with quite an air of cheerfulness that he rose at last to lock up the house and make such preparations as were necessary for his dismal ride over the mountains to Fairbanks. She had the supper dishes to wash up in Tenny's absence, and as she was a busy little housewife she found herself singing a snatch of a song as she passed back and forth from dining room to kitchen. He heard it too, and smiled to himself as he bolted the windows on the ground floor and examined the locks of the 3 lower doors, and, when he finally came into the kitchen with his great coat on to give her his final kiss, he had but one parting injunction to urge, and that was that she should lock the front door after him and then forget the whole matter till she heard his double knock at midnight. She smiled and held up her ingenuous face. "Be careful of yourself," she murmured. "I hate this dark ride for you, and on such a night, too." And she ran with him to the door to look out. "It is certainly very dark," he responded, "but I'm to have one of Brown's safest horses. Do not worry about me. I shall do well enough, and so will you, too, or you are not the plucky little woman I have always thought you." She laughed, but there was a choking sound in her voice that made him look at her again. But at sight of his anxiety she recovered herself, and pointing to the clouds said earnestly, "It's going to snow. Be careful as you ride by the gorge, Ned. It's very deceptive there in a snowstorm." But he vowed that it would not snow before morning, and giving her one final embrace he dashed down the path towards Brown's livery stable. "Oh, what is the matter with me?" she murmured to herself as his steps died out in the distance. "I never knew I was such a coward." And she paused for a moment, looking up and down the road, as if in spite of her husband's command she had the desperate idea of running away to some neighbour. But she was too loyal for that, and smothering a sigh she retreated into the house. As she did so the first flakes fell off the storm that was not to have come till morning. It took her an hour to get her kitchen in order, and 9 o'clock struck before she was ready to sit down. She had been so busy she had not noticed how the wind had increased or how rapidly the snow was falling. But when she went to the front door for another glance up and down the road, she started back, appalled at the fierceness of the gale and at the great pile of snow that had already accumulated on the doorstep. Too delicate to breast such a wind, she saw herself robbed of her last hope of any companionship, and sighing heavily she locked and bolted the door for the night and went back into her little sitting-room, where a great fire was burning. Here she sat down, and determined, now that she must pass the evening alone, to do it as cheerfully as possible, and so began to sew. Oh, what a Christmas Eve, she thought, and a picture of other homes rose before her eyes, homes in which husbands sat by wives and brothers by sisters, and a great wave of regret poured over her, and a longing for something, she hardly dared say what,